There was another slave trade, older than the Atlantic one by 1,000 years, lasting into the 20th century, and by some scholarly estimates, it carried away as many Africans or more. If it really moved that many human beings for that many centuries, their descendants should number in the tens of millions today, scattered across the Arab world like Black Americans are scattered across this one. They don't. The descendants are almost impossible to find. And when scientists compared the DNA of Black America to that vanished trade, the genetics revealed exactly where all those people went. To talk about this responsibly, we have to start with who actually counted. The most rigorous attempt to put numbers on all of Africa's slave trades at once came from the Harvard economist Nathan Nunn, whose 2008 study in the Quarterly Journal of Economics pulled together decades of historical work to measure 4 separate systems: the transatlantic trade and 3 others: the trans-Saharan, the Red Sea, and the Indian Ocean trades, often grouped together as the Arab or Islamic slave trade. His data leaned on historians like Ralph Austin, who spent years reconstructing the caravan and shipping records, and Paul Lovejoy of Cambridge, whose book Transformations in Slavery remains a standard reference. These are not fringe voices. They are the people who built the field, and what their numbers show is a story most of us were simply never taught. Part of why it went untaught is that it is hard to count. The Atlantic trade left ledgers, ships' manifests, insurance records, port logs, because it was a centralized industrial-scale business run by chartered companies that wrote everything down. The Arab trade was the opposite: diffuse, ancient, spread across deserts and seas, conducted by countless merchants over more than a millennium. Much of it never recorded at all. So historians have had to reconstruct it from fragments, caravan accounts, traveler descriptions, tax records, the registers of slave markets. The result is real knowledge, but blurry knowledge with error bars the Atlantic numbers simply do not have. That blurriness is one reason the trade slipped out of public memory. It is much harder to teach a crime you can only estimate. Here's the shape of it. The Atlantic slave trade, the one we all know, forced roughly 12.5 million Africans onto ships across about 4 centuries. And it is by far the best documented of all of them. The Arab trade is older and far harder to count. It began in the 7th century and did not fully end until the 20th, running for more than 1,300 years. It drew its captives not from the Atlantic facing west, but from the other side of the continent, from East Africa, the Horn, Sudan, and the Sahel, moving them north across the desert and east across the sea into North Africa, the Middle East, Persia, and India. Zanzibar became one of its great hubs, a clearinghouse where people from deep in the interior were sold alongside ivory and cloves. The conditions were their own kind of horror. The march to the coast or across the desert killed staggering numbers before anyone reached a market, captives roped together and driven for hundreds of miles. The dead and the dying left where they fell along the caravan routes of the Sahara. Those who survived were funneled toward wildly varied fates. Most enslaved women became domestic servants and concubines in households from Morocco to Persia. Men were put to work as laborers, soldiers, pearl divers in the Gulf, and household servants. And in at least one notorious case, the system did look like the Atlantic plantation model. In 9th century Iraq, tens of thousands of enslaved East Africans, known as the Zanj, were forced to drain the salt marshes near Basra in brutal gang labor until they rose in a massive revolt that shook the Abbasid Empire for nearly 15 years. That rebellion is one of the few moments the trade's African victims forced their way into the written record on their own terms. The totals are genuinely uncertain, and honest scholars disagree about them, but the combined estimates for the trans-Saharan, Red Sea, and Indian Ocean trades generally run from around 10 million to as high as 17 million people over that long span. In other words, a trade comparable in scale to the Atlantic, possibly larger across its full 13 centuries, and one that has almost no place in popular memory. That alone is a number nobody mentions. But it is not the strange one. The strange one is this: the Atlantic slave trade produced a vast, visible, enduring population, Tens of millions of people across the Americas today, Black Americans, Afro-Caribbeans, Afro-Brazilians, carry deep, unmistakable African ancestry and identify with it. The trade was a catastrophe, but its victims left a flourishing, identifiable lineage behind them. That is what you would expect any movement of millions of people to do. The Arab trade did not. Despite moving a comparable number of human beings, despite running 3 times as long, it left behind no comparably large population of self-identified, African-descended people across the Arab world. There is no community of 200 million in the Middle East tracing itself the way Black America traces itself to the Atlantic crossing. The descendants you would predict from the raw numbers are, for the most part, simply not there. A trade that lasted 13 centuries should have flooded the gene pool of an entire region. Instead, the African genetic signal across most of the receiving world is faint, scattered, and easy to miss. This is the genuine puzzle that has fascinated historians and geneticists alike. In the Americas, the descendants of the enslaved are not hard to locate. They are entire nations, entire cultures, hundreds of millions of people whose African ancestry is central to who they are. If the Arab trade was even half the size some estimates suggest, the equivalent population should be spread across North Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, and beyond. Yet outside a handful of small specific communities, that population does not announce itself. It is not that East and Sahelian Africans were never taken in vast numbers. The records, fragmentary as they are, make clear that they were. It is that something happened to them or to their ability to leave descendants that did not happen in the same way on the other side of the continent. So the question writes itself. If that many Africans were taken for that long, where did all their descendants go? This is where the DNA stops being an abstraction and starts telling a deeply uncomfortable truth. To understand it, think of a family tree as having 2 kinds of branches. The branches that pass down through mothers and the branches that pass down through fathers. Geneticists can read each separately. One type of DNA, carried in the mitochondria, traces a pure line back through a person's mother, her mother, and so on. Another, on the Y chromosome, traces the pure line back through fathers and sons. In a normal population, the African contribution would show up roughly equally in both, mothers and fathers passing their ancestry forward side by side. In the population shaped by the Arab trade, it does not. Where sub-Saharan African ancestry survives across the Middle East and the Arabian Peninsula, genetic surveys have repeatedly found that it runs far more strongly through the maternal line than the paternal one. The mother's African branches grew on. The father's African branches were, to a shocking degree, cut off. Scientists call this pattern sex-biased admixture, and the history behind it is as brutal as anything in the human record. The Arab trade was not built primarily around male field labor the way the Atlantic plantation system was. Its demand ran the other way. The majority of those taken were women and girls, destined for domestic servitude and for concubinage in households across the Islamic world. By many scholarly accounts, the trade ran roughly 2 enslaved females for every male, the mirror image of the Atlantic trade, which carried about 2 men for every woman. And the men who were taken often met a fate designed to guarantee they would never reproduce. Enormous numbers of enslaved African men and boys were made into eunuchs, castrated to serve as guards and attendants in households and harems, where a man who could not father children was considered safe to place among women. The operation was crude and the death toll appalling. By many historical accounts, the majority of those subjected to it did not survive. Those who did served out their lives unable to pass on a single gene. An entire category of men was biologically erased from the future in one stroke, generation after generation, for century upon century. That is why the paternal African line goes quiet across the receiving world. It was not bad luck or slow dilution. It was severed deliberately by the design of the trade itself. There is one more piece, and it explains why even the surviving descendants are so hard to see. Under Islamic law and custom, an enslaved woman who bore her master a child occupied a special status. She generally could not be sold, and her child was born free, a full member of the father's society. Within a generation or two, the descendants of these unions were simply absorbed into the broader population, no longer marked as a separate, enslaved, descended caste. Their African ancestry did not vanish, but it dissolved, diluted, and folded into the wider gene pool until it became a faint thread rather than a distinct people. Put those forces together, a female-heavy trade, the mass castration of men, and the steady assimilation of mixed children, and you get a slave trade that moved millions and yet left almost no concentrated genetic monument to itself. The descendants are not missing. They are dispersed, blended invisibly into the population of a dozen nations, carrying a maternal whisper of an ancestry that history stopped naming. The numbers nobody mentions are the descendants who, by the design of the system itself, were never allowed to become a visible people at all. Now compare that to the DNA of Black America, and the contrast snaps into focus. When geneticists read the ancestry of African Americans, most comprehensively in the 2020 study by Stephen Micheletti and his colleagues at 23andMe, what they find is overwhelmingly West and West Central African. The slave ship records agree. Of the roughly 12.5 million people carried into the Atlantic trade, all but a few 100,000 came from the western half of the continent. Black Americans are the concentrated genetic legacy of that Western Atlantic system. The East African and Sahelian peoples who filled the Arab trade are, for the most part, not in that ancestry at all. These were two largely separate machines, drawing from different regions of Africa and pointing in opposite directions across the map. They produced opposite genetic footprints. The Atlantic trade, for all its horror, concentrated African ancestry into large communities that survived, reproduced, and held on to their identity. So today, it is loud and unmistakable in the genome. The Arab trade scattered and severed and absorbed. So today it is quiet, surviving mostly as a maternal trace in populations that no longer think of themselves as African descended at all. You can almost watch the two machines run in opposite directions on the map. The Atlantic trade pulled people west, off the coasts of Senegal, Ghana, Nigeria, the Congo, and across one ocean to a handful of plantation societies where they were kept together in large numbers, and in places like North America, grew into millions. The Arab trade pulled people the other way, north over the Sahara and east over the Indian Ocean, out of East Africa and the Sahel, and then dispersed them thinly. A few to this household, a few to that one, across an enormous territory where they were absorbed rather than concentrated. One trade built a people, the other dissolved one. Same crime, same scale, mirror image outcomes, and the genome remembers both. Same scale of suffering, opposite legacy, and the difference between them was decided entirely by what was done to the bodies of the enslaved, their sex, their capacity to have children, the laws that govern their offspring. The footprint of a slave trade, it turns out, has almost nothing to do with how many people it took and almost everything to do with what it did to them. Before we go on, I have to be very careful with you because this topic gets weaponized constantly and the weaponization is dishonest. First, the numbers for the Arab trade are estimates with far wider error bars than the meticulously documented Atlantic records. Serious historians genuinely disagree about the totals, and anyone who quotes a single precise figure is pretending to a certainty the evidence does not support. Second, and this matters more, none of this is a competition over whose slavery was worse, and none of it lessens the Atlantic trade or the societies that ran it. Both were vast human catastrophes. Pointing at one to excuse the other is exactly the move this channel refuses to make. Third, this is history, not an indictment of Arabs or Muslims living today, any more than the Atlantic trade is an indictment of every European alive now. The trade also enslaved many non-Africans. The very word slave comes from Slav. The point of laying these two systems side by side is not blame. It is to understand a mechanism and to recover people the record erased. It is also worth saying that slavery in the Islamic world was not one single thing across 13 centuries and 3 continents. It ranged from the unimaginable cruelty of the eunuch trade and the Zanj labor camps to forms of household and military servitude that could, in specific cases, lead to influence or even power. Some enslaved soldiers rose to command armies and found dynasties. None of that variety softens the core fact that millions of human beings were stolen, sold, and broken, but flattening it into a single cartoon would be its own kind of dishonesty. And this channel would rather give you the real, complicated thing than a satisfying simple one. The honest version is that this was a sprawling, varied, and devastating system whose African victims were, by its very structure, made to disappear from the long memory of the world. If you stayed with me through the hard part, you understand what this channel is for. Taking the history that got buried on every side and bringing the evidence back into the light. If that matters to you, take a second to subscribe. It genuinely determines whether work like this keeps getting made. Then stay for the last piece, because it changes who this story is really about. Because the deepest thing the genetics does here is give the disappeared their reality back. For 13 centuries, millions of human beings were taken from East Africa and the Sahel, and the system that took them was engineered, whether by intention or by cruel accident, to leave no trace, no descendants who could stand up generations later and say, "We are still here, this happened to our people." The Atlantic trade failed to erase its victims. Their descendants became Black America and Brazil and the Caribbean, loud and alive and impossible to deny. The Arab trade came much closer to succeeding at erasure, and for a long time it did succeed, which is exactly why so few people have ever heard of it. But the body keeps the record even when the society forgets. That faint maternal line surviving in a family in Iraq or Arabia or Iran is the genetic ghost of a stolen woman who was never allowed to be remembered as African. And modern science can now find her. It cannot give her back her stolen name. Not really, but it can prove she existed, that she was taken, that she had children who lived, and that some part of her crossed 1,300 years to reach a descendant who never knew. That is not a small thing. For a trade built on erasure, simply being seen is a kind of justice. There is something almost defiant in it. The system was engineered to leave no lineage, no people, no monument, to use human beings up and let them dissolve into someone else's family tree without a trace. And yet the trace remained, too small to see with the naked eye, waiting in the mitochondria for a technology that would not exist for 1,000 years. The enslaved could not have known that the very cells of their bodies would one day testify on their behalf, long after every trader and every ledger had turned to dust. But they do. The erasure was almost perfect. Almost is the word that matters. And for Black Americans, the comparison clarifies something too. Your ancestry is specific. It is the western coast of Africa, carried across one particular ocean by one particular trade. Not a vague continent, not every African story at once, but a precise and recoverable origin. Knowing which trade made you is part of knowing who you are. The science here doesn't sensationalize any of this. It does something steadier and more honest. It shows that history has more than one great crime in it, that some crimes were designed so well that they nearly disappeared from memory, and that the truth can still be pulled out of the cells of the living when every document has gone silent. 2 trades, 2 oceans, 2 opposite shadows left on the human genome, and millions of people on both sides of that map who deserve to be counted. It changes how you read the word forgotten, too. We tend to assume history forgets things by accident, that the past simply fades. But the Arab trade shows that forgetting can be built into a system from the start, that a people can be erased not only by being killed, but by being prevented from leaving anyone behind to remember them. That is a darker and more deliberate kind of disappearance than most of us ever consider. And the only reason we can speak about it at all today is that the erasure ran into one thing its architects never anticipated: a thread of DNA, passed quietly from mother to child, that outlasted every empire that tried to bury it. If this opened a door you didn't know was there, the next video walks through it, to the rare communities that the Arab and Indian Ocean trades did leave behind. The African descended peoples of India, Pakistan, and the Gulf who held on to their identity against every force pushing them to disappear, and what their DNA reveals about the homeland they were taken from. They are, against all of it, still here. That story is waiting for you. I'll see you there.